Two really esteemed scholars, and I'm happy to call them colleagues in the field of migration studies to the University of Utah this morning, Drs. Patricia Fernández-Kelly and Dick Bilsborrow. Together, their work spans global and local contexts, explores origins and destinations, and takes both quantitative and qualitative approaches to bring us closer to understanding international migration and its implications for our ever more globalized world, our increasingly diverse communities, and the increasingly fragile ecosystem in which we coexist. What I'll do is I'll introduce each speaker in turn before they speak, and then after they've completed their presentations, we'll open up to Q&A, recognizing that we do want to get down to the keynote and address, but we'll give them the time that they're here for and that they deserve, and hopefully we'll have time for some question and answer. Our first speaker this morning is Dr. Dick Bilsborrow. Dr. Bilsborrow is a professor of biostatistics, a faculty fellow at the Carolina Population Center at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and co-founder founder of the Center for World Environment and Sustainable Development, which is an inter-university initiative of Duke University, UNC, and NC State University. In his work as an economist demographer, Dr. Bilsborrow has traveled the world researching and educating on the subjects of economic development, demographic processes, especially migration and international migration, and then their complex interactions with the biophysical environment. Dr. Bilsborrow has taken his expertise on population and development and the environment to UN agencies, environmental organizations, and heads of states in developing countries. Currently, his research focuses on demographic and other factors that influence land use and deforestation and its implications for the environment and sustainable development, especially in the Ecuadorian Amazon, the determinants and consequences of international migration or internal migration in developing nations, and then methodological approaches to conducting and analyzing surveys on international migration. I'll turn over the table now to Dr. Bilsborrow, and he is going to speak to us on the subject of international migration in the new millennium, who migrates and why.
Thank you very much. Let me see if I can get the... and we come down here. I appreciate the generous introduction. I have a connection with Princeton, which is the place of the next speaker, where I learned demography. And I should mention I'm really an economist demographer. I'm not a biostatistician. It's an accident of history that I'm in that particular department. And most of my work, I would say, is in Latin America, but I've been in other places as well. And I want to talk about some of the data, provide kind of an overview of global migration and even some global migration policy issues from my perspective as an academic and also as someone who has worked a lot with the United Nations. So Erica George mentioned before the number of international migrants in the world as measured by living in a country other than their country of birth rose to 191 million in 2005 according to the United Nations Population Division, which is the source of data. Most of that data comes from population censuses. Some of it comes from guesswork. You can see in this, the reddish areas are the areas with relatively large populations of foreign-born. And there are a few surprises there. I won't go into this. This is not necessarily the best way to define international migrants, but it's what's available because of the availability of census data. The 3% is the proportion of the world population now living in countries other than their country of birth. And there is a lot of talk about how this is the age of migration, a famous book by Stephen Castles and how there's been a huge increase, but in fact international migration has existed throughout human history. And you can even see from the numbers on the chart that it has only increased slightly since 1960. Nevertheless, the proportion is much higher in the developed countries and is rising. This is based on lifetime migrants. So this proportion, 3%, is the accumulated process of international migrants in a country. So if you want to study recent migrants, which I maintain is what we're interested in studying. We're not interested in what caused people to come here 20 or 30 years ago. Governments and policy people and just academics, other than those looking at a longer-term historical perspective, are interested in recent migration. Why are people coming here in the last 5 or 10 years? And should we be doing anything about that? And you can see that the annual average in-migration rate to more developed countries in the world was 0.2%, which means in a 5-year period, you'll have 1% of their country's population being migrants, which is a very small proportion. I call that the rare elements problem in some of the work that I'll be getting to later. There are only 16 countries with over 4 million people in the world which had over 10% of their population foreign-born in the latest UN data. I'll leave one of these here if you're interested in consulting it. This is also available on the web. The UN, unlike the World Bank, provides everything, including full publications, as well as all of its data on the website, the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. So you can find a host of data there. There are only 7 larger countries, over 10 million, which had over 10% of their population. You can see the list there. Includes the United States with 13% as one of those 7. In terms of the stock of international migrants living in their borders, the U.S. has 38 million. The next largest stock is Russia with 12, much of that due to people being stuck in Russia after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. People from other countries which had been part of Russia, but they became countries, so then people who were born in those countries that were in Russia then were suddenly foreign-born. And so there's been a lot of that going on in Europe in recent times. Now, there's another myth. Patricia is going to talk about myths regarding U.S. migration, and there's some very interesting data. I thought about presenting to you about that, but that's her topic. But international migration, it's not all south-north as one is commonly thinking. It's really divided pretty equally in 3 groups in terms of the lifetime stock. Now remember, this is the lifetime stock. More recent migration is more south to north. Since 1990, the number of international migrants living in developed countries has increased rapidly, but it has not increased at all, basically, in developing countries in the last 17 years. So the global stock of migrants in developed countries, and this includes refugees, it was only in 1995 that stock became greater. The number of refugees has in fact been declining as people have gone back to, for example, Afghanistan and other countries which had huge refugee populations, places in Africa too, although this is now changing in Sudan. The only countries in the world with over 1 million population which had a net annual immigration rate over 1%, that is, people coming into the country being more than 1% per year in the 2000 to 2005 most recent period, were, and you can see it's a strange set of countries. Some of that is repatriation of refugees, such as Afghanistan, where it's positive, and a few countries where it's negative. And these are all relatively small, 1 to 2% per year. Developed countries with the highest annual inflows in that 5-year period were Spain and Ireland. Less than 1% a year of the population was constituted by immigrants. Spain, of course, has a huge migration from Ecuador and other places in Latin America that's begun in the late 90s. You can see the other countries with high average migration flows. Look at the United States, 0.4%. That means in a 5-year period, it's only about 2% of the U.S. population that is constituted by recent immigrants. Main countries of emigration, I'll skip over that. The percentages are also very small. The percent of the population of those countries leaving in a year in that 5-year period. So who migrates? That's supposed to be the title of my talk, but I'm actually not going to say much about this because who migrates internationally is not too different from who migrates internally. There is increasingly flows from south to north and to particular countries of destination, which is why those countries have become very concerned about this as a political issue, as currently is in the U.S. Political debate. And McCain has taken a very liberal stance, which has caused him some difficulties with his party. Most migrants are labor migrants or people who follow the labor migrants or join them later. In the U.S., this is embodied in the family reunification provisions, which legally allow 2/3 of the total to be family reunification. So once the migration process starts, then networks are built up, and then other family members want to come, and then relatives and friends and other people from the same origin communities, as Doug Massey and others have found in the studies of Mexico. Almost all migration is voluntary. There are exceptions. Refugees are forced to move for either environmental problems or civil conflicts or religion. And there's also human trafficking in all countries of the world, including, sadly, this country. They're working age mostly because they're for work, but they're a little bit older than internal migrants, and they also have to be a little bit wealthier than internal migrants in developing countries to finance the move. They're highly motivated. Education is, we don't know, it varies a lot. Sometimes it's highly skilled and sometimes it's very low skilled. The countries of destination, the positive aspects, this is part of a new consensus, which is going to be one of the two themes of my talk. The positive aspects of migration on the societies, not just for the migrants themselves, tend to be dominant, and this is the increasing consensus, I think, of research. It's not universal, but most migrants fill local labor needs and contribute to economic growth. They pay more in taxes than they cost the country in services received. There have been some studies by economists on that. Population aging, that is, fertility has declined so much, that aging is due to fertility decline, not to lower mortality, primarily. We're running out of workers, and we will be running out of workers in the developed countries because of such low fertility, especially in Europe and Japan. So this whole issue of replacement migration as a justification for immigrants and the need for immigrants was a concept that was developed by the UN Pop Division at a population conference meeting about 10 years ago. And the Europeans, I remember a prominent European demographer from Italy at that meeting said, no, we don't need to let all the immigrants come in to replace the fact that we don't have enough workers. But he's totally changed his viewpoint in the last 10 years. Migration has other positive effects, and those are really important in terms of cultural and food. And I mean, in North Carolina, we have a huge Latino population, and now we have great Mexican restaurants. And we didn't have that before. But there are some common drawbacks to immigration. The adaptation and the assimilation process involves a lot of tensions. Undocumented irregular migration leads to the issues that were, I think, being addressed in the panel this morning of their rights and their living conditions. We'll see more data on that later. There's sometimes adverse effects on particular groups, and I myself am still wondering what are the effects of Latino immigrants on lower income, lower skilled black populations in the United States. North Carolina would be an excellent state to do such a study because we have large populations of both. And the environmental effects and whether there are just getting to be too many people for the environment. too much pressures is an issue that's talked about. The replacement migration is illustrated in this nice little slide. This is for all developed countries with migration that is expected to take place at current level, more or less projecting current trends into the future. With and without migration, the labor force would take a real dive in many countries. I could show you Germany, for example, where it's really quite severe, and Italy and so on. So the international migrants are increasingly needed in the developed countries. In countries of origin, they used to talk about all the negative effects on brain drain, but now they're beginning to see that the benefits are primarily positive in countries of origin. They're not the poorest persons who leave because they have to pay for it. Remittances have grown enormously. I'll have a slide in a minute on that. They benefit families, but they tend to be families that are better off in their communities of origin than the other families that do not have immigrants. So the receipt of remittances can often increase inequality in communities of origin, at least initially. But over time, the development of networks with those communities of origin and communities of destination, whether it's Utah or elsewhere, leads to better options for the less skilled and the poor migrants to move and continue the flow. Return migrants and visits have been found to have important effects on technology and investment in the home country. And the brain drain issue, well, that's complicated. I won't go into it. But remittances received by developing countries are now approaching about $200 billion a year. This is about twice the level of all forms of economic aid, multilateral and bilateral, received by the developing world from the developed world. So, and it's larger than the value of export earnings in many countries, and so on. Three messages of the report of the Secretary General at the meeting in Turin, Italy in 2006 that I attended was, therefore, that international migration is a key component of globalization, positive force for development in both countries of origin and destination. I'm going to skip this policy one. Common interest exists of countries of origin and destination involving human rights. Why do people migrate? I have a list of, whoops, we lost the, what did I do? Okay, that was easy. I have mostly some economic theories which talk about their migrating because of wage gaps, and the huge wage gaps that exist mean that they are never going, that this migration tension and the pressure is going to exist whatever governments may do. I'm not going to talk about that, our census of data. Yeah. Now, data collection systems. The other message I want to get across is that migration involves rare events. We're interested in recent migrants, and if we want to study determinants or consequences, census data are not going to be adequate. They can't get us the detailed data we need. So to study the process better, we need to use survey data. We can adapt existing surveys, the best prospects, because they have large sample sizes and are regular in developing countries, our labor force surveys, but it's hard for them to collect an adequate sample. So it's better to design specialized surveys if you can find money. And there are operations. These are different surveys that could be adapted. So the surveys should have large sample sizes. If you had a survey of 10,000 households in a country with 10% of the foreign-born, which is very high, or 3% recent migrants, you'll only get 600 adult migrants. That's not enough to do serious analysis on. So you have to design special surveys. Migration is a social experiment. I'm only going to show that we need data about migrants and non-migrants in order to study why people migrate. And this will be my last slide on this topic, which is if you want to study why people migrate, you need a survey in the country of origin, and you need a survey in the country of destination. And you're interested not in current data, but in data that's retrospective at the time of the migrants moving. So I want to go to the last slide. I was involved in a project in Europe where they studied migration in 7 countries. and in a study of Colombian migrants in Ecuador, which used specialized sampling methods. There's ongoing efforts that the World Bank is undertaking in Sao Paulo and Belgium and beginning in Africa. And there's ILO experiments trying to collect better data in 4 countries. And the take-home messages regarding the state of knowledge, I'll just read this last slide. The state of knowledge is weak. If you get into this scholarly literature, migration is much more complicated than fertility and mortality. It involves 2 countries, and there's lack of adequate data to study determinants or consequences of migration. You usually need surveys in both countries of origin and destination on individuals and household, and you should use specialized sampling methods, which I can give you some references to, including my book with the UN. And the policy conclusion is that both countries generally are benefiting from migration, and therefore there is a complementarity that needs to be addressed. And a new international consensus is emerging, which was not there before. The Europeans are taking the lead in this. The U.S. is probably lagging behind, but the World Bank, OECD, and others are recognizing this mutual benefit from international migration. But this is not manifest in certain countries' policies yet.
Thank you very much for a great discussion of the policy issues and a good overview of what is occurring globally. Our next speaker this morning will be hearing from Dr. Patricia Fernández-Kelly. Professor Fernández-Kelly has a joint appointment in sociology and the Office of Population Research at Princeton University. She is a social anthropologist with an interest in international development, international migration, and she is an early student of export processing zones in Asia and Latin America. Her book on Mexico's Maquiladora program, For We Are Sold, I and My People, Women and Industry in Mexico's Frontier, was featured by Contemporary Sociology as one of the 25 favorite books in the last 25 years. She has also been involved in producing a very important documentary, an Emmy Award-winning documentary on the Global Assembly Line. And currently, her latest projects focus on ethnographic research on immigrant children, immigration and health, and views of power, subordination, and morality among inmates in maximum security prisons. So a wide variety of research, which really, I think, continues to shed a lot of light and bring voice to men, women, and children who are being shaped by globalization, economic restructuring, and other global and social economic issues. Today, Patricia will present her paper titled To Welcome the Stranger, Realities and Misconceptions about Immigration to the United States. So welcome, Patricia.
Well, I'm hoping not to overstay my welcome, so I will simply mention that I am very honored and very delighted to have been invited to participate in this conference, and I look forward to the other panels. I have 20 minutes, is that correct? Is it going to be less or is it going to be more? That's the only thing I need to know. A little bit less, yeah. Darn! Silenced for being a woman. No, that is not true. That is not true. As has been said before, the first panel was remarkably informative and very helpful. I think that the presentation by Richard Bilsborrow was equally informative. And so one should ask the question, particularly at this time and in the United States, so if these are the facts, what is all the fuss about? And I'm here to suggest to you that unfortunately, very, very unfortunately, legislators and members of the public at large do not first read the text produced by thoughtful philosophers, and investigators of human rights, or the important works that result from empirical research, like the one we just heard, before they make up their mind as to whether they're going to like or hate immigrants, or blacks, or women, or gay people, etc. So that here I'd like to focus my very brief presentation on three factors that I think are helpful to understand the present situation. And I'm only going to address two myths that I think are important, and one, a reality of unauthorized immigration, so that the message that I want to send, which I'm hopeful is not just based on opinion, but in fact supported by some empirical research, will remain in your minds. Now, I detect that most of us in the audience are friendly, and so that actually kind of detracts a little bit of the fun, as far as I'm concerned. Because to be perfectly honest, ladies and gentlemen, as much as I like you and as much as I appreciate your being here, I would prefer Lou Dobbs to be right there where you are sitting. Or perhaps Tom Tancredo, or perhaps Peter King, and the multitude of politicians and media pundits who have very opportunistically profited and maximized their own benefit from an intuition, and that is, if you make use of fearful strategies to agitate a particular constituency, you are going to be well on your way to make political gains. So let me begin very quickly by just reiterating something that has been repeated at least 3 times already, and that is about 3% of the world's population migrate across international borders. Now, I don't know whether you've thought about the figure, but the figure really indicates that by international standards, a very small percentage of the world population actually crosses international borders in order to settle in places of destination. And the consideration is important for 2 reasons. First of all, it draws attention to the difficulties of international migration. Most people, including those who are willing migrants, I am one of them, do not leave places with which they are familiar, where their next to kin are residing, where their friends and their cultural traditions have long been formed with a happy heart. That kind of separation is painful for all of us, even those of us who voluntarily and looking forward to the future decided to uproot ourselves from those places of origin. It is more the case for refugees, for exiles, and certainly for the vast majority of people who become labor migrants, not of the sophisticated kind, that is not highly educated or with great ambitions in the labor market, but who are willing to use their bodies and their ambition in order to provide services, mostly so that they can support their own families and those whom they love and are close to in places of origin. And so it is not easy for most people to confront that kind of fate. I do not have the time to provide you with vignettes of people who have actually destroyed identity documents while crossing continents in an airplane in order to arrive in a place strange and unknown, in the hope that they will be treated with some kind of welcoming spirit by the immigration authorities. I can assure you that I would never be able to do that. I'm already chastised and extremely unhappy about having to take my shoes off in airports, and the idea of just throwing myself upon the mercy of strangers is something that fills my heart with awe. The other thing that this figure attracts attention to is that although the figure is small, 3% of the world's population, It has already been said, I think it's worth remembering, that by and large those who migrate are individuals who do not come from the poorest of the poor, but indeed from those who belong in the middle classes, whether in rural settings or in urban settings. And the reason is, as Richard just intimated a moment ago, because migration is an incredibly arduous and expensive proposition. If you do not have the inimical, psychological, and material resources, to say nothing about contacts in places of destination, it is very unlikely that you will attempt that kind of migration. I don't think so far, but surely in the future, we will hear presentations that emphasize a major issue in international migration, and that is the role of social networks in facilitating movement across international borders, but also in lowering the cost of migration, because most people who migrate to different countries do so in the knowledge that someone will be waiting for them in places of destination. And this, of course, is not of little significance to us in the United States, considering that there was one large migration around 1848, which did not entail solely human beings. It entailed, if I remember correctly, an international border. It just moved south. And it migrated in such ways through conquest that many people who used to think of themselves as Mexican suddenly became, I think, American citizens. And so not only do, and I'm not holding any grudges, don't look a little somber. I'm just trying to point to something that is important, and that is that throughout their histories, Mexico and the United States have been profoundly interpenetrated in a political and economic sense. And the War of 1848 is but one single instance in which migration was redefined as a result of the reconfiguration of territory through violence. And so this is important because, yes, there are many Mexicans residing in the United States who have their roots in a Mexico that anteceded the transformation of that territory into an American possession. But even more recently, we know, and again, for lack of time, I won't go into details over this, that Mexico is the United States' second or third largest trading partner, secondary only to Canada, if memory serves, and that increasingly, thanks to the implementation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, there is growing movement of products, investment, and yes, people across international borders. So this brings me to my second point. Recently, I wrote an article, and what a privilege that was, with Douglas Massey, who, by the way, is the creator of the Mexican Migration Project, which Richard, I'm sure, knows about, and which is one of the most ambitious research projects that I've ever known, because it is a longitudinal survey complemented with ethnographies in depth that looks at points of origin and points of destination for Mexicans. And this he has been doing with his partner, Jorge Duran, for many years. I wrote an article which is now available in a volume that I edited with my buddy John Scheffner from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, entitled NAFTA and Beyond, Alternative Perspectives in the Study of Migration and Development, which came out in 2007. The article to which I make reference, which I co-authored with Doug Massey, is called The Effect of NAFTA on Unauthorized Migration to the United States. But the long and the short, although I think the content of the paper is worthy of your attention, is this, and that is that the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was implemented early under the Clinton administration, made some important assumptions about the quality and the quantity quantity of the global economy. And it made provisos in order to demolish all kinds of barriers for capital investment and movement, in the presumption that it would improve conditions both in places of destination, mainly Mexico, and in places of origin, that is the United States. The North American Free Trade Agreement is but one of the instances and symptoms of what we all know, and that is growing economic and political integration at the global level. But I want to compare NAFTA with the creation of the European Union. Not because I think the European Union is perfect, I realize that there are some flaws in it, but at least the architects of the European Union understood that it is just completely irrational. You don't really need a rocket scientist here to liberalize all kinds of provisions regarding investment and capital movement, while at the same time presuming that workers are going to stay put in their countries of origin. In the United States, for reasons that are described in that article, we did not make the same assumption. So while in Europe, the idea was to level off and to provide certain basic economic and political rights to countries that could conceivably become the source of immigrants interested in opportunity in other European countries, say countries like Portugal and Spain in particular, actually took the time to make sufficient investments, not necessarily to completely develop Portugal and Spain, but to make sure that there wasn't going to be a rush of immigrants to places like Germany or other more prosperous countries. In our case, for reasons that are idiosyncratic to the United States, we never did that. In fact, the architects of the North American Free Trade Agreement staunchly and continuously refused to include any labor provisos in the treaty, thus ensuring that we would have illegal migration on the ascent. So while the trend in the country is to blame lawbreakers and to breastbeat about the importance of institutions and the sacredness of the law in America, there is no attention given to some more subtle trade aspects of this phenomenon, which, when put into place, ensured that we would have the kinds of difficulties that we have at present. My third point has to do with immigration in the context of post 9/11 anti-terrorist threats. As has been said before by various speakers, and certainly as has been documented by Doug Massey, most of the 20th century was one of toleration of unauthorized immigration. And the reason was simple. Most undocumented or unauthorized immigrants come from Mexico, which is another problem that I hope will emerge here. Because when people talk about illegal immigration in the United States, it sounds, I mean, of course, if you are Mr. Huckabee and have never learned anything about this, you would conclude that, yeah, it's a big problem with all those Pakistanis that are coming here illegally. But the real issue as far as unauthorized immigration has very little to do with unauthorized Pakistanis. It has a huge amount of significance having to do with the presence mostly of Mexicans and increasingly with people from Central America. And so here I'll just stress 2 points. One is that because of the economic and political interdependence that I alluded to before, most of the 20th century was characterized by an atmosphere of toleration. This began to change in 1986, but it really reached hysterical proportions in the post 9/11 period when the Immigration Service was, for all practical purposes, destroyed and folded into the Department of Homeland Security, thus making immigration de facto a security issue. And naturally, following that logic, polls were information was pooled, resources were consolidated, and Homeland Security began going after people with final deportation orders. But of course, we have very few terrorists in this country, and even very few people from the countries that presumably produce terrorists. And so the result is that most of the deportation orders and the assault went to people like the Guatemalans, that is, people who had entered this country fighting a genocidal war, and ended up being declined hospitality, but then ended up being deported because we know how threatening and confounding Guatemalan terrorism is. And so this has been a great victory for Homeland Security, because I'm here to let you know that in fact we are winning the war against Guatemalan and Mexican terrorism. Thus proving the capacity of our politicians and policymakers. And the final point here, however, is that this has resulted in egregious abuses of authority. I am not here to announce that there has been gross illegality, but there are things that are legal and yes, yet they are immoral. And among them I include as a paramount concern the deportation of children who have grown up in the United States and who have been deported to countries which they don't know and which they cannot remember. In my last minute, I want to speak of two myths, but there's more in the paper, and one reality. One of the myths that most confounds me and annoys me has to do with the portrayal, particularly of first-generation immigrants, as criminals, simply because this is not supported by any kind of empirical evidence. And if you, as a result of this brief presentation, want to share this information with people who have now been invited quite successfully to fear immigrants because they have now been criminalized, please spread the word that most of first-generation immigrants are not criminals, except unless you just want to consider them criminal as a result of their having violated a civil statute, that is, they're crossing the border without papers. First-generation immigrants do not tend to engage in criminal activity for a very simple reason. They came to this country in search of work. They try to keep a low profile, and they're very interested in maintaining their independence in order to support their families in places of origin. The second myth that I believe is important to emphasize has to do with the burdens that immigrants create upon the public trough. I am involved in a study of immigration and health, and if you want the details, please let me know. But having interviewed now something in the order of 58 medical institutions in Miami and San Diego, and having spoken at great lengths with directors of emergency rooms, I don't see them being particularly worried about undocumented aliens. They are worried about a much larger population, low-income people who use emergency rooms as the places of primary care because of an inefficient system of medical care. Give me just a few more seconds in order to speak to one of the realities that is of greatest concern to people like myself, by which I mean people who actually do research on these subjects. And that is the knowledge, which I'm sure will come up again in this conference, that we have about the regularities with which certain processes operate and result in desirable and undesirable outcomes. We do know that the history of immigration to the United States is more or less like this. People come, they are despised, they are not welcome, they are self-enduring, they work hard, they are exploited, but there is hope because they're connected to the market. Eventually, they're able to move out of slums. They move into better positions. So the combination between markets and exploitation and a certain toleration and opportunity in education in the labor market generally allows for this gradual incorporation into the larger society so that we can end up being Irish Americans and wear green t-shirts that say, "Kiss me today, I am Irish." This is a wonderful story, very consistent with the American dream. Where we have seen precisely the opposite outcomes is where we have greeted migrants or internal migrants with hostility, so that opportunities in education and advancement in the labor force have not materialized. People forget that that is very much the story of African Americans, that African Americans in the Great Black Migration really do constitute one of the largest movements of people that the country ever witnessed, and that we did not meet them with a kind of mixed, kind of fierce hospitality that we extended to other migrants. So at present, the real problem that we are confronting is that the kind of hospitality that these misguided laws and policy applications will bring the immigrant experience a little bit into convergence with the worst of the African American experience, in which people who find thwarted opportunities in this country and barred channels for mobility will indeed fulfill the most perverse of self-fulfilling prophecies, and that is exclusion. And if you want to know about this, I will give you a few examples both from my research and recent events. And so that what we would like is for some people who are in positions of responsibility to use facts rather than emotion in order to rationalize immigration policy, because although there are some short-term political advantages in capitalizing on the fears of the American public, the long-term negative consequences are very real and not consistent with our national identity. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
I've been informed that since we're past time, that we will need to postpone questions until after other sessions. I'm sorry, this is sort of to keep in timing with the keynote address. So we will now proceed down to Dumke Auditorium in UMFA for Dr. Selah Ben Habib's keynote address. So thank you to both of the panelists for great presentations.